Dianna Saunders was a typical middle-class mom.
Her life really kind of revolved around her kids.
But she was also starting over after a recent divorce, which meant a new home.
Bought the house with the idea of gutting it and renovating it.
A new career.
She was getting her real estate license.
And a new man.
They were becoming an item.
But just as things were looking up, her new boyfriend was murdered.
Oh my God, he's not breathing.
He had a bullet wound to the head.
And his throat was slit.
Was it the jealous ex?
He was devastated from the divorce.
Or was Dianna really the one pulling the strings?
You paid them to do this.
Before it was all over, 2 men would be dead.
They found the note.
Another would be out almost $500,000.
And the money was just disappearing.
And there would be only one thing left for Dianna to say.
I want my attorney.
Friday, August 29, 2008. It was a long summer evening in the historic town of Dover, New Hampshire.
Dover is quintessential New England. It's a small, quiet town.
But there was nothing quiet about the 911 call that a Dover emergency operator took at around 7:15 that evening.
911, what's your emergency?
He was in the basement. He had been on a ladder.
And based on what the woman told the dispatcher, the fall had been serious.
Is he conscious?
No, he's not responding to me.
Is he breathing?
I don't know.
The female caller is hysterical.
Oh my God, he's not breathing. He's not breathing.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you how to do chest compressions.
They talked her through doing CPR.
Chest 400, how do you do that?
And the dispatcher told her to keep pumping until the first police officer arrived 8 minutes later.
As soon as I drove up, I knew exactly whose house it was.
The owner of the house was the woman who'd called 911, a 40-year-old real estate agent named Dianna Saunders.
Our children actually interacted in extracurricular activities, gymnastics, dance, things like that.
Once inside the house, Officer Giebers found Dianna in the basement with her boyfriend, 46-year-old David King, who appeared to be seriously injured.
There were pools of blood around the area where his body was.
Officer Giebers pulled Dianna aside as the paramedics arrived and went to work on her boyfriend.
Hysterically crying, sobbing.
And almost without prompting, the story of what happened came pouring out.
She said that she had been out getting some groceries and movies and had returned to the home and found David King in the basement on the floor.
However, Dianna had only been talking to the officer a few minutes before one of the paramedics brought some devastating news. David was dead. And it wasn't the fall that killed him. David King had been murdered.
His throat was slashed, and he had what appeared to be a bullet wound to the head.
And the search for his killer wouldn't just expose a tangled web of money and deceit. It would end with 3 people charged with murder and 1 lying dead in a lonely motel room. Born in 1967, Dianna had grown up a world away from Dover's quaint New England charm.
She's from the Reno area of Nevada.
The product of a normal middle-class childhood. By high school, she appeared to be an all-American girl.
She was very close to her mother. Happy, always bubbly. She was well-spoken. Seemed to get along very well with a lot of people.
She married young, shortly after high school, but it ended in divorce. And by the time she was in her 20s, she was still in Reno, struggling to get by on her own.
She was a dancer.
But that all changed when she met Roy Saunders. 7 years older than Dianna and recently divorced, Roy didn't live in Reno.
Roy Saunders was going to school in California. He and a friend took a trip to Reno.
The first of many trips once he'd met Dianna.
Roy Saunders was very devoted to her, very much in love with her.
The two started dating, and when Roy finished school, they got married and moved to the Boston area to be closer to his family, especially Derek, Roy's son from his first marriage.
Derek and Dianna always seemed to have gotten along.
Once back in Massachusetts, the couple settled in the suburbs, and Roy got a good job.
He works for the Mass Bay Transit Authority, a local subway system here in Boston.
However, they wouldn't stay in the suburbs long. In 1996, Dianna and Roy had their first child, a daughter. And when Dianna gave birth to a second little girl in 2000, she started longing for someplace a little less hectic.
Dianna Saunders wanted a more quiet, rural environment to raise her children.
And with that in mind, the couple moved just over the state line to Dover, New Hampshire.
It's small-town New England, just on a slightly larger scale.
It's one of the best places to raise kids. It's a good family place.
Together 5 years by the time they settled in Dover, the Saunders fit right in. The quintessential middle-class family. 40-year-old Roy got up every day and commuted into the city.
He was still working in Boston.
And Dianna, who just turned 33, stayed home with their two little girls, the oldest only 4.
Her life really kind of revolved around her kids.
She's the typical soccer mom.
Settling in quickly, Dianna and Roy soon made friends, starting with a family that lived down the street. David King, his longtime girlfriend, and their 3 children.
David King, who was a general contractor, local handyman.
There were neighborhood barbecues. The two couples got together. They went to each other's homes.
And naturally, when Dianna decided their house needed some renovations,
Dianna Saunders and Roy Saunders hired David King.
at least renovation work was what David was supposed to be doing. But as the job dragged on and David spent more and more time alone in the house every day with Dianna, people began to wonder, was something else going on?
I heard that she and Dave were kind of becoming an item.
And before long, it wasn't just the neighbors who suspected something was going on. In 2003, David King's girlfriend contacted Roy and told him that she was convinced David and Dianna were having an affair. Not that Roy had a clue. As far as he knew, his 8-year marriage was a happy one.
He didn't believe her at first.
But over the next few weeks, he started having doubts. And when he confronted Dianna about it, she not only admitted that she was sleeping with David, she also told her husband that they'd fallen in love.
Dianna and Roy ended up getting divorced.
Roy moved back to Massachusetts, closer to his job, but near enough to Dover that he could spend plenty of time with his daughters.
He was a very devoted and involved father to their daughters.
Roy's 21-year-old son, Derek, out of school and living on his own, remained close to his half-sisters, too.
He would occasionally come to Dover and have dinner with Dianna and the girls.
He was the much older brother, but kind of like a second dad to the kids.
In fact, Dianna's girls had no shortage of father figures. After Dianna's divorce, David left his girlfriend too. And in 2004, David and Dianna bought a home together.
She and David bought the house on Old Dover Point Road with the idea of gutting it, basically, and renovating it.
It had plenty of room for Dianna, David, and the girls. In fact, it was so big that her former stepson Derek even moved in for a while, along with a 35-year-old friend named Scott Mazzone.
They had lost whatever living place they had for some reason.
Dianna allowed them to stay in the basement.
It was only a few months, and by the time they moved out, Dianna had started a career.
She was working on getting her real estate license.
Once Dianna had her license, she went to work for a local real estate office.
Dianna Saunders apparently was relatively good at it, had some success in that business.
So successful that in 2007, Dianna quit her job and started a real estate and remodeling company with David, D&D Construction.
Their plan was to flip homes, take a a home that was in poor condition, make it livable, and sell it for a profit.
David King had the construction expertise and she had the sales expertise.
There was one thing they lacked, though, working capital. But she thought she had found a backer, a recent client and retired chiropractor, Dr. Meredith.
He was very impressed by the work that she did for him because she was able to get a better price for the property than other real estate agents had told him he could get.
Not only did the sales process leave him impressed with her real estate skills, she and the recently widowed chiropractor had also grown close.
He came to think of her as like a daughter.
And in October of 2007, Dianna asked her 75-year-old surrogate father for a favor.
She approaches him and asks him to help her and David purchase a home that's in need of repair.
The chiropractor ended up putting $400,000 into Dianna and David's new venture.
He got a reverse mortgage on some property.
Dianna bought the house and David went to work.
And as soon as it was renovated, she had a buyer who was prepared to buy it.
All Dianna and David needed to realize their dream was for David to finish the job. But as every homeowner knows, no remodel ever comes in on schedule. On Friday evening, August 29, 2008, police in Dover, New Hampshire responded to a frantic 911 call from 40-year-old real estate agent Dianna Saunders.
911, what's your emergency?
According to what Dianna told the operator, it appeared that her boyfriend, 46-year-old David King, had fallen off a ladder while working in the couple's basement.
She found David lying in a pool of his own blood. She doesn't know what happened.
Although when the police and paramedics arrived minutes later, they quickly realized that whatever had happened to David, it was no accident.
He had what was clear to me to be a gunshot entrance wound to his left temple.
His throat was slit.
And whether it was the gun or the knife that killed him, David King was dead.
When she was told by the officers that he was in fact dead, she again became hysterical.
At that point, the patrol sergeant comes over and says to me, we need to get her down to the police department.
The Dover police not only needed to get a statement from Dianna, they also had some pointed questions for her. Because as it turned out, that night wasn't the first time that the police had been to her house. Dianna had also picked up the phone and dialed 911 a month earlier on July 26th.
Dianna Saunders called 911 to report that David King had been abusive.
Somehow or another, an argument between her and David King became physical. David King threw something.
It was only a glass, but it was enough to earn David a trip to jail.
He was arrested and charged with criminal mischief.
He pled guilty to that offense and was sent to essentially a domestic violence counseling session.
But a month later, with David dead, the police couldn't help wondering if there was a connection between the two incidents.
The shift commander that night, he said, something's not right here.
That's what the investigators suspected. But when they brought Dianna into the station and sat her down for questioning that night, she all but dismissed the possibility of trouble in the relationship.
The account she gave was that she and David were very happy, that their relationship was very good.
You guys weren't arguing or fighting again over, and he wasn't upset that he was going to counseling?
Nope, not anymore.
Okay.
He was at first.
Mm-hmm. But not yesterday and not today?
No.
Dianna said that she and David had put the incident well behind them. In fact, with her daughters at her ex-husband's for the weekend, she told the investigators that she and David had been planning a quiet night at home, alone.
He was gonna make brownies. We were gonna have brownies and ice cream and watch videos.
And according to Dianna, at about 5 p.m., while David was working in the basement, she had run some errands in preparation for their evening together.
Dianna had gone to the grocery store.
After that, she said she had gone to the video store, rented 2 movies, and returned home at around 7 o'clock.
I went downstairs with the videos to show David what I picked out.
She found David lying there in a pool of blood.
At first, I thought it was water from the pipes, but it was his blood.
She went upstairs, grabbed the phone, called 911.
Throughout the interview, Dianna appeared genuinely distraught.
And sometimes hysterical in the course of the interview.
Uncontrolled sobbing, things like that.
Especially whenever the investigators left her alone in the interview room.
What am I gonna do without you?
In fact, Dianna appeared so genuinely upset that the police let her go home after the interview. And when they went to the grocery store to check out her story, they confirmed that she had been there at around the time David was killed.
She used the self-checkout, so she's right there on video.
Not only had Dianna's alibi checked out, by then, the investigators had a hot lead on the possible killers. The clue had come from one of Dianna and David's neighbors.
When investigators started asking some of the neighbors, have you seen anything suspicious? Someone had said they had saw a green Jeep with Massachusetts plates.
And the Jeep, parked at the end of the trail that led through the woods behind David and Dianna's house, wasn't all that neighbors had seen either.
The neighbor told the Dover police that he was sitting in his yard at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening and saw two men leaving the home and walking in the direction of the woods.
And while the neighbor hadn't seen their faces, he did think one of the men seemed familiar.
He thought that he recognized the shorter of the two men as Derek Saunders, Dianna Saunders' stepson.
The neighbor told the investigators that 25-year-old Derek had briefly lived in Dianna and David's basement, along with a roommate, a man named Scott Mazzone.
They were working together at the same insulation company.
And when the investigators did a little digging on Mazzone, they made what appeared to be a breakthrough.
Scott had a green Jeep that was registered to him in Massachusetts.
The Dover investigators immediately contacted the police in Newbury, Massachusetts, where Derek was currently living.
They found that there was an outstanding warrant for Derek Saunders relating to a traffic fine. The decision was made to bring him in on that warrant and interview him.
And on August 31st, 2 days after the killing of David King, the investigators from Dover sat down with Derek Saunders at the Newbury Police Department. However, the investigators weren't there to talk to him about any traffic ticket. By then, they had uncovered strong evidence that Derek and his friend Scott Mazzone could have been in Dover at the time of the murder. First, running the plates for Scott's Jeep revealed that they had crossed over into New Hampshire on the evening of the murder.
There was video of him at the toll booth at the Hampton Tolls, which you have to go through to get from Newbury to Dover.
Derek's cell phone records appeared to confirm the destination, too.
Cell tower records indicate that his cell phone was used while it was traveling north into Dover.
And when the investigators confronted him with the evidence in the interrogation room,
he denied it at first.
But it wasn't long before Derek started to sweat.
We're able to essentially just keep poking holes in his story.
And once he realized that the investigators had him in a corner,
it doesn't take long for him to become very emotional.
So emotional that he cracked.
He actually admitted that he and Scott had done this murder.
Derek told the investigators that he and Scott Mazzone had driven to Dover on Friday evening and parked the Jeep exactly where it had been spotted, at the end of a trail that led behind the Saunders house.
They walked down that trail and then left the woods and crossed the backyard.
Derek said that David hadn't suspected a thing when he and Scott had come in the back door.
He called out to David King. David responded that he was down the basement.
Derek said that he'd gone down the stairs while Scott followed.
Scott Mazzone had the rifle out.
David says something to the effect of, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" And then almost instantly, Scott Mazzone raises the rifle and shoots David King in the head.
And then, according to Derek, he'd pocketed the spent round, while Scott cut David's throat.
He wants to make sure that David's dead.
Not only was Derek obviously still shaken by the experience,
Derek was extremely emotional, appropriately so.
his story appeared to conform with everything the investigators knew about the crime scene. But there was still one question for Derek to answer. Why?
He told the police Dianna Saunders wanted David killed.
By Sunday, August 31st, 2008, it had been 48 hours since 40-year-old Dianna Saunders had dialed 911 and reported finding her boyfriend, David King, dead in their Dover, New Hampshire home.
His throat was slashed, and he had what appeared to be a bullet wound to the head.
Dianna's former stepson, 25-year-old Derek Saunders, had confessed to the crime.
He admitted to being involved in the murder.
According to Derek, he and a 40-year-old friend, Scott Mazzone, had killed David at his stepmother's request. According to Derek, Dianna wanted David dead in order to protect her daughters.
Derek was told that David King was being abusive to his half-sisters.
Angered by the allegations of abuse, Derek said he'd agreed to kill David and use Dianna's offer of $8,000 to bring in his friend Scott Mazzone, too.
He was motivated to participate in the killing because he wanted to buy a four-wheeler.
He seemed like someone that would do just about anything for money.
Once Derek finished his story, the Dover investigators placed him under arrest. And then they brought Scott Mazzone in for questioning.
Scott takes the approach of, I'm not going to admit to anything.
But then, after several grueling hours of interrogation,
he finally just says, stop, I've had enough.
He had cracked, just like his friend Derek.
His account was relatively the same as Derek Saunders' account. He admitted that he was the one who had used the rifle, had shot David King, and had cut his throat.
There was one difference, though. According to Scott, it wasn't Dianna who paid them to kill David.
Roy Saunders is where they obtained the money, not Dianna Saunders.
The unexpected news that Dianna's ex-husband was apparently involved in the murder plot caught the investigators by surprise. So after placing Scott under arrest, they went back to Derek and confronted him with his friend's story.
Derek Saunders eventually admits that he had lied to us initially, that it was his father, Roy Saunders, that actually paid him.
Although Derek maintained that Dianna was involved.
David was being abusive to her and the girls, his two half-sisters.
Not quite sure just what or who to believe, the investigators drove back to Dover that same day to interview Dianna again.
Both of these guys have confessed to their involvement in this murder, and they've both implicated you. Okay? Because you paid them to do this.
No, I did not.
Yes, you did.
No, I did not.
And unlike Derek and Scott, she wasn't about to cave under pressure.
You need to start being honest. Okay?
I want to go home now.
You want to go home now? You don't want to clear this up?
Not quite ready to make another arrest, the investigators let Dianna go. Besides, they still had one more member of the alleged conspiracy to talk to. On September 1st, the investigators interviewed Roy Saunders at a Massachusetts State Police barracks in Boston.
He said, I've been meaning to reach out to you guys. I figured you guys would want to come talk to me. I want to help in any way I can.
In his statement, Roy claimed it was January of 2008 when Dianna had first approached him.
She began telling Roy Saunders that David King was being abusive to their daughters, and she wanted Roy Saunders to find someone to kill him.
And Roy, enraged by Dianna's allegation that David was abusing his daughters, said that he had agreed.
He would do anything for those two girls.
And when Dianna gave him the money to pay for the hit, Roy said he turned to his son, Derek.
Roy always assumed that Derek would kind of be the middleman and somebody else would commit the murder.
And according to Roy, It was only after the murder that he discovered the shocking truth that Derek and his friend Scott had decided to do it themselves.
On the way back, they actually stopped at Roy Saunders' home to pick up the money.
The police now had 3 confessions, but that didn't mean they'd made a 3rd arrest.
Roy Saunders agreed to engage in an attempt to gain incriminating statements from her.
Roy Saunders was given several recording devices on his person as well as planted inside his vehicle.
But when Roy and Dianna did meet outside a local shopping mall on September 2nd, she proved hesitant to talk.
She never trusted anyone completely, including Roy Saunders.
And when Roy purposefully brought up David's death,
there's muffled whispering on her end,
followed by something else. Something that left the investigators scratching their heads. It was only after the meeting that Roy was able to explain just what they'd heard.
She has a mirror and dry erase markers with her, and she starts communicating with him by writing.
Although according to Roy, they had discussed the investigation and the fact that the cops could be listening.
She makes comments to Roy that the police have the ability to eavesdrop on conversations, that we can read lips from satellites in space. She pointed to a speck of dust on the dashboard and she said they can see that from space.
Roy was willing to testify against Dianna, but considering that he'd cut a deal with the prosecutors, they weren't sure that would be enough to put Dianna in prison. So the investigators didn't give up just yet.
We tried several other recorded telephone calls.
Although Dianna remained as cautious.
We gotta talk.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, it's not cool to do it this way.
But Roy said it was urgent. He told Dianna that he feared Derek and Scott were cooperating with the police and wanted to know what he should do about it.
Do you want him talked to? Well, do you want him heard of? Do you want to follow me? Or do you want it all the way, like Dave? What do you want me to do?
What?
And when Roy pressed her about it, Dianna played dumb.
I'm lost here.
She likes to manipulate people. She likes to be smarter than everybody else.
It was extremely hard to get any information from those recorded conversations.
After months of trying, Roy's help had gotten them nowhere. So the investigators decided they had little choice but to charge Dianna's ex-husband with conspiracy to commit murder.
A date was scheduled for him to turn himself in to the Dover police on those complaints.
That day came, and he didn't show up.
Had Roy gone on the run? Not exactly. By that afternoon, the Massachusetts State Police had tracked him down to a motel outside Salem.
They found Roy dead.
He'd overdosed on prescription medication, the victim of an apparent suicide.
He did leave a note just saying, "I wish there was another way."
Their star witness gone, it looked as if the case was in danger of growing cold. In fact, Dianna had even left town, moving all the way from New Hampshire to Fort Worth, Texas.
She's uprooted her daughters and brought them to the new home.
But the New Hampshire authorities weren't about to give up. And on May 13th, 2009, a Dover police detective knocked on Dianna's door.
It's very unexpected on her end. She's not anticipating that the police are going to be there.
I told her that I was there simply to give her an update on some recent developments in the case.
Curious, Dianna invited the detective in, and sitting at her kitchen table discussing Roy's suicide, she made a surprising admission about David's murder.
Finally, she made the comment to me that she asked me, well, what if I knew about it?
And then, after admitting that she knew about the murder, she tried to pin the whole thing on Roy.
She admitted that Roy Saunders had told her that he planned to kill David King, that she more or less acquiesced in the plot because David was abusive to her, and she was tired of the abuse.
At least, that's what the police and prosecutors claim Dianna said. But when they brought her in for a second tape-recorded interview the next day, she didn't put it quite the same way.
What she told me was that Roy told her he was going to commit the murder, and she said, "Go ahead."
That's not my exact word.
And even if they were, Dianna claimed that she hadn't meant them to be taken seriously. On tape, Dianna said she had simply been venting, that she had been in an argument with David shortly before she spoke to Roy.
I never thought he would, nor did I ever meant any harm.
And all the cloak and dagger afterwards with the phone calls and dry erase markers.
Roy was putting me in that position.
She was claiming that she was being framed by the others, that it was Roy Saunders' plot, not her plot, to kill David King. And that's why she was so paranoid during the conversations with Roy Saunders.
Despite Dianna's attempt to talk her way out of it, between her admissions and what Roy, Derek, and Scott had already given them, the authorities figured they finally had enough. On July 29, 2009, the Dover police returned to Texas with a warrant for Dianna's arrest. And this time, when they brought her into the local sheriff's office and read Dianna her rights, she had no interest in talking.
I want my attorney.
On February 7, 2011, Dianna Saunders went on trial for murder at the Strafford County Courthouse in Dover, New Hampshire. The 43-year-old mother of two was charged with conspiring to kill her boyfriend, David King. It had been almost 3 years since Dianna had called 911 and reported finding the 46-year-old contractor dead.
He was shot first, and then his throat was cut.
Dianna's 27-year-old former stepson, Derek Saunders, and his friend Scott Mazzone had each confessed that she had paid them to commit the murder.
Both Derek Saunders and Scott Mazzone had pled guilty. Part of their plea was that they would testify at trial against Dianna Saunders.
Dianna's ex-husband, Roy Saunders, had also confessed to being a part of the conspiracy, but he wouldn't be testifying. He had committed suicide in April of 2009.
Many people believed that he did not want to have to testify.
That was a huge hurdle.
The prosecutors did have Dianna's former stepson, Derek, though. And once the trial got underway, they called him to the stand.
Derek was able to recount his relationship in the past with Dianna Saunders when she was his stepmother and how close he was with his two half-sisters.
In fact, Derek testified that his relationship with his sisters was the primary reason he'd helped kill David.
Derek testified at trial that he wanted to protect his younger sisters.
And that, according to Derek, had been entirely Dianna's doing. He told the jury his former stepmother had filled his head with lurid tales about how David was abusing her daughters.
That his sisters had been thrown down staircases, things of that nature.
But according to the prosecutors, Dianna's daughters, now 10 and 14, had refuted their mother's claims.
Both denied ever being abused, either physically or verbally, by David King. In fact, they really liked David.
But if that was a lie, what motive did Dianna have to want David dead? The prosecution had a ready answer.
The state's theory of the case was that this was a money-motivated crime.
And they had a witness to explain how. The elderly chiropractor who'd invested in Dianna's real estate company.
When he testified, he seemed like everybody's grandfather. He was kind of a teddy bear type guy, very sweet and kind and giving.
He told the jury that Dianna had been more than just his real estate agent. She'd become a trusted friend.
He had recently lost his wife. I think that was a big factor in him making a connection with Dianna.
He was devastated after the loss of his wife.
And that wasn't the only way the elderly chiropractor had been vulnerable either.
His wife had been the financial manager for the couple, for the practice and personally, and he was not good at that kind of thing.
So when Dianna told him about her plan to buy and renovate houses for resale,
Dr. Meredith had over $400,000. He put it into a joint account with Ms. Saunders.
According to Dr. Meredith, she was going to flip the home, and then when it was sold, he was going to get his money back, plus a percentage of the profit.
But instead, in December of 2007,
he's told by the bank that the money's no longer in the account.
The doctor was flabbergasted when somebody who he trusted absconded with all of that money.
He broke down a couple of times on the stand. That was really heart-wrenching.
Next, the prosecutors called a forensic accountant to explain just how Dianna had made off with the chiropractor's money.
She made a large transfer to yet another account set up in the name of her real estate company and then transfers to other bank accounts.
And once the money had been transferred, Dianna had started spending it.
She was spending the money on things like jewelry. She was buying clothing. There was a lot of purchases that added up, and the money was just disappearing out of the bank account.
But in July of 2008, in the midst of Dianna's spending spree, the chiropractor had suddenly showed up at her door with his attorney.
The attorney and Dr. Meredith asked for the money back, and she's able to give them just enough of an explanation to at least get rid of them.
But would she be able to hold them off indefinitely? Or would she eventually have to pay the money back in order to avoid legal action? In August of 2008, just weeks before David's murder, the chiropractor had gone to the Dover police.
And so that report was on file at the time of David King's death, but it had not yet been followed up on.
Not by the police, that is, but had Dianna. After all, she did have a way to get her hands on the money.
Dianna Saunders and David King had taken out life insurance policies on each other in approximately 2006.
And either policy was enough to pay her debt.
The policies insured each of their lives for $500,000.
Was it just a coincidence? The prosecutors didn't think so. In fact, they called Dianna's insurance agent to the stand to testify about a suspicious phone call he'd received from her just prior to David's death.
About a month before the murder, she reached out to confirm that the life insurance policies were in full effect.
The prosecution was trying to present that because she had embezzled the money from Dr. Meredith, she was trying to get the money to pay him back.
When it was their turn, the defense didn't deny that Dianna had stolen money from Dr. Meredith. But they also argued that didn't make her a murderer. Instead, they pointed to the one person who couldn't appear in court.
The defense really used Roy Saunders.
The defense argued that he had committed suicide because he had been lying to the police all along.
And according to the defense, Roy was the real mastermind behind the murder conspiracy.
That was their theory of the case, that it was Roy Saunders, that he was the wronged husband, and that it was a revenge killing, that he hated David King.
Saying, he was her ex-husband and was still emotionally devastated from the divorce. That's why he had hired Derek and had hired Scott to murder David King.
The defense also claimed that David wasn't the only one Roy had taken revenge on.
The defense was that he and his son were trying to frame Dianna Saunders.
The defense basically said that she had no knowledge of what was going on.
And the defense was apparently so confident that they'd raised enough reasonable doubt about Roy that they wrapped their case without putting Dianna on the stand. On March 7th, 2011, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of Dianna Saunders.
When we walked in, everyone seemed to be holding their breath.
The 43-year-old mother of two was charged with masterminding the 2008 murder of her boyfriend, David King, in order to collect his life insurance and avoid fraud charges for stealing almost $500,000 from a business partner.
It was a murder for hire wrapped around a pretty extensive and elaborate financial scam.
She was very manipulative and uncaring, and she would do whatever she could to make her life better, and didn't matter who she took down in the meantime.
At trial, The defense had pinned the entire thing on Dianna's ex-husband, Roy Saunders. A confessed member of the conspiracy, he'd committed suicide rather than face charges.
We knew that the absence of Roy Saunders was a problem for us.
It had apparently been a problem for the jury, too.
We voted a number of times, and it was pretty divided.
There was some concern, what's taking so long?
But in the end, the jury had reached a verdict.
Dianna Saunders was found guilty. She will spend the rest of her life in prison.
And her New England neighbors will be left wondering, just how did such a typical soccer mom orchestrate such a heinous crime?
She's probably one of the most evil people I've ever met, and I didn't even realize it.
She's the type of person that would be on the PTA with you, not the type of person that you would think is plotting a murder.
On the surface, it was just another quiet night in Rome. The streets were still alive with the lingering rhythm of late-night cafes, passing cars, and conversations drifting through narrow alleyways. Millions of people were ending ordinary days, preparing for work the next morning, or returning home after spending time with friends. There was nothing about the city itself that suggested Italy was only hours away from confronting one of the most disturbing criminal cases of the decade. Hidden behind the walls of a modest apartment in the Colatino district, an act of extraordinary violence had already unfolded, one that investigators, prosecutors, psychologists, and the public would spend years trying to understand. Yet despite countless reports, forensic examinations, and courtroom proceedings, one question continued to linger long after the trial had ended. Why? In many murder investigations, detectives begin by looking for familiar motives. Money, revenge, jealousy, long-standing personal conflicts, organized crime, family disputes, crimes of passion. Human violence, while tragic, often follows patterns that investigators recognize. But every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit those patterns. A crime that seems to challenge the assumption that violence must always serve a purpose. The murder of 23-year-old Luca Verani became one of those rare cases. The brutality of the attack shocked even experienced investigators. It was not only the violence that horrified Italy. It was the apparent absence of any meaningful reason behind it. Luca Verani was not involved in a feud. He was not being targeted for financial gain. He had not spent years making enemies. According to prosecutors, there was no elaborate conspiracy waiting to be uncovered. No hidden criminal network directing events behind the scenes. Instead, what emerged during the investigation was a far more unsettling possibility. The young man had become the victim of an almost meaningless act of violence, carried out by two individuals whose judgment had deteriorated after days of consuming cocaine, alcohol, and other substances. Their own statements would later suggest that they had discussed harming someone without selecting any specific target. It was a possibility so difficult to comprehend that even after the legal proceedings concluded, public debate across Italy continued to revisit the same uncomfortable question. Could a life truly be taken for no reason beyond a destructive impulse born from intoxication and psychological collapse? The names that would dominate newspaper headlines in the days that followed were Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado. Before March 2016, neither name carried national recognition. Afterward, both became permanently associated with one of the country's most infamous homicide cases. Their actions would be examined through forensic science, criminal law, psychiatry, and public opinion. Every decision they made during those critical hours would be reconstructed piece by piece. From the moment they isolated themselves inside an apartment, to the choices they made after the killing, and finally to the evidence that prosecutors argued demonstrated the participation of both men. Yet amid the attention focused on the perpetrators, another name risked becoming overshadowed, the name of the person whose future ended that night. Luca Varani was 23 years old. Friends described him as sociable. He lived in Rome, worked freelance jobs, and maintained a long-term relationship with his girlfriend. Nothing in the available evidence suggested that he anticipated danger when he agreed to meet someone he already knew. Nothing indicated that he believed he was walking into a situation from which he would never return. Like many victims whose stories become known only after tragedy strikes, Luca's ordinary life suddenly became the center of extraordinary public attention. The details of his final hours would be analyzed repeatedly in court documents, newspaper articles, and television programs. But before those final hours, there had simply been another young man living an ordinary life in one of Europe's oldest cities. That ordinary life is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. There was no dramatic buildup spanning years, no escalating conflict documented by police reports, no series of threats warning that violence was inevitable. Instead, the investigation suggested that Luca's path crossed with two men whose state of mind had been profoundly altered after prolonged consumption of cocaine, alcohol, and other substances inside an apartment where they had remained for days with little sleep. According to later findings, the environment inside that apartment had become increasingly detached from normal reality. Decisions that would seem unimaginable under ordinary circumstances gradually evolved into conversations that prosecutors believed culminated in a fatal plan. Understanding those days would become essential to understanding everything that followed. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they found themselves tracing events backward rather than forward. Every phone call, every message, every forensic sample, every witness statement added another fragment to a puzzle that initially appeared almost impossible to solve. The physical evidence would ultimately reveal a crime of exceptional brutality, but the psychological question remained far more elusive. Courts can determine legal responsibility. Forensic experts can identify injuries, reconstruct timelines, and connect suspects to weapons. Yet explaining why human beings commit acts of extreme violence is often far more complicated than proving that they did. That distinction became one of the defining features of the Luca Varani case. Prosecutors would ultimately argue that there had been no conventional motive. The court would reject the idea that intoxication erased criminal responsibility. At the same time, the case ignited national conversations about drug abuse, mental health, and the limits of legal explanations when confronting crimes that appear irrational. For many observers, those discussions proved almost as unsettling as the crime itself. Because if a murder cannot be explained by hatred, greed, jealousy, or revenge, then what remains? This story is not about glorifying violence or transforming its perpetrators into objects of fascination. Their names appear because history requires them to appear. But they are not the center of this story. The center is a young man whose life ended inside an apartment he entered believing he would soon leave again. The center is the investigation that sought to establish facts instead of rumors. The center is the courtroom where evidence replaced speculation, and where judges were asked to determine responsibility based not on public outrage, but on forensic findings and legal standards. It is also a story about how a single crime forced an entire country to confront uncomfortable questions about addiction, accountability, and the frightening possibility that some acts of violence emerge without the motive society has come to expect. Over the next chapters, we will reconstruct the events of those days exactly as they were established through the available evidence and judicial findings. We will begin by stepping away from the crime scene itself and returning to the lives that existed. Before the headlines, before the investigation, before the courtroom, before the nation learned the name Luca Verani. Because to understand why this case continues to be remembered across Italy, we must first understand the ordinary lives that collided during those final days of early March 2016, and how an encounter that appeared routine would become one of the country's most haunting true crime cases. Before the investigation reconstructed the final hours of Luca Verani's life. Before forensic reports documented the violence that occurred inside an apartment in Rome. There was simply an ordinary young man living an ordinary life. That fact is easy to overlook in cases that receive intense media attention. Public memory often becomes dominated by the details of a crime, reducing victims to little more than names in court documents or photographs attached to newspaper headlines. Yet every victim existed long before becoming part of a criminal investigation. Luca Verani was one of those people. At 23 years old, he was living in Rome, working freelance jobs, and building a future that, while still uncertain like that of many young adults, remained open with possibility. Those who knew him described him as friendly and sociable. He had no criminal record, no documented history of violent behavior, and no reputation that suggested he was involved in dangerous disputes. He was also in a long-term relationship with his girlfriend, another reminder that his life extended far beyond the brief and tragic period that would later dominate public discussion. There is nothing in the known facts of the case to suggest that Luca anticipated becoming the victim of a violent crime. He was not hiding from anyone. He was not attempting to escape enemies. Investigators found no evidence of a prolonged conflict between him and the two men who would later be accused of his murder. That absence of hostility would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. In many homicide investigations, detectives begin by examining the victim's relationships, searching for individuals who possessed a clear motive to inflict harm. Financial disagreements, family disputes, jealousy, revenge, or organized criminal activity often provide an initial direction. In Luca's case, however, prosecutors would later conclude that none of these familiar explanations adequately described what had happened. Understanding the victim, therefore, means recognizing not only who he was, but also what he was not. He was not selected because of a personal feud that had been building over months or years. He was not caught in the middle of an organized criminal conflict. He was not the target of a robbery that escalated unexpectedly into murder. Instead, according to the evidence later presented in court, he became entangled in circumstances that appear to have developed almost entirely inside another environment, an apartment where reality itself had begun to deteriorate under the influence of prolonged substance abuse. While Luca continued living his normal life elsewhere in Rome, two other men were entering a period that investigators would later reconstruct with careful attention. Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado spent the days of March 2nd and March 3rd, 2016, together inside Fafo's apartment in the Colatino district of Rome. The apartment would eventually become one of the most closely examined crime scenes in modern Italian criminal history. But during those initial days, it was simply a private residence where two individuals isolated themselves from the outside world. According to the findings later presented during the investigation, they consumed large quantities of cocaine, alcohol, and other substances over an extended period. Their use of drugs was not limited to a single evening or a brief gathering. Instead, it continued for many hours, stretching across consecutive days. Reports indicated that they barely slept during this period and spent thousands of euros purchasing cocaine. Sleep deprivation, combined with repeated consumption of stimulants and alcohol, gradually altered the atmosphere inside the apartment. Although investigators could reconstruct many of the physical events that occurred there, The internal psychological deterioration of the two men could only be understood through their statements and the conclusions presented during the legal proceedings. Prosecutors argued that the environment became increasingly detached from ordinary judgment. What began as prolonged substance use eventually evolved into conversations that would later become central to understanding the crime. According to Manuel Fafo's later account, the two men discussed harming someone. The statement itself remains among the most disturbing elements of the case because of what it lacked. There was no identified enemy, no individual who had wronged either man, no carefully selected victim chosen because of a specific grievance. Instead, prosecutors concluded that the conversations centered on the idea of harming someone without any conventional motive. That apparent absence of purpose would later become one of the principal reasons why the case generated such widespread public attention throughout Italy. Violence is often horrifying, but violence without a recognizable motive can appear even more unsettling because it resists the explanations people instinctively search for after tragedy. According to Fafo's own statements, the discussions eventually progressed beyond words. He later told investigators that he and Marco Prado drove through Rome with the intention of finding a random victim. The city itself remained unaware of the danger moving through its streets. Thousands of residents continued their routines, unaware that two men were allegedly searching for someone they did not even know. Yet despite those reported intentions, they found no victim during that drive. Whether through chance, circumstance, or simple coincidence, the search ended without violence. For a brief moment, it appeared that whatever dangerous ideas had emerged inside the apartment might dissolve without consequence. Instead, events took a different direction. Rather than encountering a stranger, Marco Prado contacted someone he already knew, Luca Verani. The relationship between the two men was not presented as one defined by personal conflict. Instead, investigators established that Prado reached out to Luca and offered him approximately €100 in exchange for a sexual encounter. The proposal itself, according to the evidence available, contained no obvious warning signs that would have suggested imminent danger. Luca agreed to meet him. That decision, viewed in isolation, was an ordinary human choice made without knowledge of what investigators would later uncover. One of the recurring tragedies in homicide investigations is that victims almost never possess the information available to those examining the crime afterward. Looking backward with the benefit of forensic evidence and court findings, it becomes easy to identify moments that seem significant. Yet at the time those decisions were made, they appeared entirely different. Luca could not know what investigators would later determine about the previous 2 days inside the apartment. He could not know that prolonged cocaine use, heavy alcohol consumption, lack of sleep, and increasingly disturbing conversations had already transformed the environment he was about to enter. From his perspective, he was responding to an invitation from someone he knew. From the perspective of investigators reconstructing the timeline later, that invitation became the final link connecting an unsuspecting victim to two men whose behavior had, according to prosecutors, deteriorated dramatically over the preceding 48 hours. The contrast between these parallel realities is perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. On one side stood an ordinary young man continuing with his life, unaware that his evening would become his last. On the other side, inside an apartment in Calatino, two individuals had isolated themselves from the outside world while consuming enormous quantities of drugs and alcohol, sleeping very little, and engaging in conversations that prosecutors would later argue revealed an intention to commit extreme violence. Neither reality existed in isolation forever. Eventually, they converged through a single phone call and a single decision to meet. As investigators later reconstructed every movement leading to that encounter, They realized that understanding the crime required examining not only the attack itself, but also the environment that preceded it. The prosecution would argue that the days before Luca's arrival were essential because they demonstrated the gradual progression from prolonged intoxication to violent intent. At the same time, the courts would later make an equally important distinction. Although drug and alcohol consumption formed part of the factual background, they did not eliminate criminal responsibility. That legal conclusion would become central during the trial. But before the courtroom addressed accountability, investigators first needed to determine exactly what happened after Luca crossed the threshold of the apartment. The ordinary life he had lived until that evening would soon intersect with one of the most brutal crimes Italy had witnessed in years. And once he entered the apartment in the early hours of March 4th, the story would shift irrevocably from background to tragedy. As the night of March 3rd, 2016, gave way to the early hours of March 4th, Rome continued to move with the quiet rhythm of a city that never truly sleeps. Across its neighborhoods, restaurants were closing. Taxis carried passengers through nearly empty streets, and apartment lights slowly disappeared one by one. For most residents, it was an ordinary transition from one day to the next. Inside an apartment in the Colatino district, however, the atmosphere had already become detached from ordinary reality. According to the evidence later established during the investigation, Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado had spent the previous days consuming large quantities of cocaine, alcohol, and other substances while sleeping very little. Prosecutors would later argue that this prolonged period of intoxication formed the background, against which the events of that night unfolded. Yet despite the role those substances played in the timeline, the courts would ultimately conclude that neither man had lost the legal capacity to understand the nature of his actions. That distinction would become crucial later during the trial. At this moment, however, another person was about to enter the apartment with no indication of the violence that awaited him. Luca Varani accepted the invitation extended by Marco Prado. Based on the evidence presented during the investigation, Prado had offered him approximately €100 in exchange for a sexual encounter, and Luca agreed to come to the apartment. Nothing contained within the known facts suggests that he anticipated danger. There was no reported confrontation before his arrival, no evidence that he expected hostility, and no indication that he believed he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. Like countless ordinary meetings that occur every day in large cities, the decision to visit someone he already knew likely appeared routine. Tragically, investigators would later determine that this ordinary decision marked the beginning of the final chapter of his life. After Luca entered the apartment, investigators concluded that he was offered alcohol. In addition, forensic findings established that he was given medication intended to reduce his ability to resist. Although many aspects of those final hours could only be reconstructed through physical evidence and subsequent testimony, investigators reached the conclusion that these substances significantly weakened the victim before the violence began. The balance of power inside the apartment changed dramatically. Instead of facing two men on equal terms, Luca found himself in an increasingly vulnerable condition while surrounded by individuals whose judgment had already deteriorated after days of consuming cocaine and alcohol. It is impossible to know every thought that passed through his mind during those moments. Investigators can reconstruct actions through evidence, but the private experiences of a victim during a crime often remain beyond complete understanding. What the forensic evidence could establish, however, was both the sequence and the severity of the assault that followed. According to the official forensic examination, Luca Varani was struck multiple times with a hammer, primarily to the head and face. The attack did not end there. He was also stabbed repeatedly with a knife during a prolonged assault that lasted for more than 2 hours. Medical experts later determined that many of the injuries were inflicted while he was still alive. Ultimately, he died from blood loss and multiple traumatic injuries. Those findings would later become some of the most important pieces of evidence presented before the court. They demonstrated not only the cause of death, but also the exceptional cruelty recognized by the judges during sentencing. Even experienced investigators confronted with violent crime found the nature of the injuries deeply disturbing. Yet throughout the legal proceedings, prosecutors avoided reducing the victim to the brutality inflicted upon him. Instead, the forensic evidence served a precise purpose. Every documented injury helped reconstruct what had happened inside the apartment. Every wound contributed to establishing the timeline. Every forensic observation became part of a larger effort to determine responsibility based on objective evidence rather than speculation. This distinction mattered because the legal process demanded facts, not emotion. Although public reaction understandably focused on the horrific nature of the attack, the investigation required careful documentation of every physical finding to support the prosecution's case. The duration of the assault became one of its most chilling aspects. Unlike crimes committed in a sudden burst of violence lasting only seconds or minutes, investigators concluded that Luca endured a prolonged attack extending over more than 2 hours. That length of time would later influence the court's assessment of the case, contributing to the conclusion that the killing demonstrated exceptional cruelty. The prolonged nature of the assault also contradicted any suggestion that the death resulted from an instantaneous loss of control. Instead, prosecutors argued that numerous opportunities existed during those hours for the violence to stop. According to the court's later findings, those opportunities were not taken. Eventually, the attack ended because Luca Varani succumbed to his injuries. The forensic conclusion identified blood loss combined with multiple traumatic injuries as the cause of death. At that point, another series of decisions began, decisions that investigators would later interpret as efforts to conceal the crime rather than seek help. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado partially cleaned the apartment after Luca had died. They also hid some of the victim's clothing. These actions would later become significant because they suggested an awareness of what had occurred in an attempt, however incomplete, to interfere with the immediate discovery of the crime. The apartment itself became both the location of a homicide and a repository of physical evidence that investigators would later examine in extraordinary detail. The events that followed did not end inside the apartment. Investigators established that messages were sent from Luca Varani's phone after his death in an apparent effort to mislead those who might become concerned about his whereabouts. These communications formed another important component of the prosecution's reconstruction because they demonstrated activity intended to delay suspicion. Every message created a false impression that Luca was still alive and communicating normally. Although such attempts ultimately failed, they illustrated a sequence of decisions made after the killing rather than during it. From an investigative perspective, actions taken after a crime often provide insight into a suspect's awareness of guilt. In this case, prosecutors would later argue that the concealment efforts, however limited, reflected precisely such awareness. Perhaps even more unsettling to many observers was what happened next. Rather than immediately contacting emergency services or remaining at the apartment, investigators determined that both men left the scene and went out drinking at various bars. This aspect of the timeline shocked the Italian public almost as much as the violence itself. The image presented during the investigation was deeply unsettling. After the prolonged killing of a young man inside the apartment, the two defendants resumed activities that outwardly resembled an ordinary night out. For prosecutors, These actions formed part of a continuous sequence demonstrating behavior after the crime. For the public, they became one of the most difficult aspects of the case to comprehend. Yet despite the apparent effort to distance themselves from what had occurred, the concealment did not last. According to the established timeline, Manuel Fafo eventually experienced what investigators described as a psychological collapse. At some point after the killing, he confessed to members of his own family. That confession marked the turning point of the entire investigation. Until then, the crime remained hidden behind the walls of the apartment. Once Fafo disclosed what had happened, his family contacted the authorities. Their decision ensured that the events inside the apartment would no longer remain secret. Law enforcement officers responded and entered the residence. Inside, they discovered the body of Luca Varani. What had previously been known only to the two perpetrators now became the subject of a full homicide investigation. Detectives immediately secured the apartment as a crime scene. Every room, every object, every visible trace of violence would soon be documented with forensic precision. The apartment that had served as the setting for days of drug use and the site of a prolonged assault was transformed into one of the most extensively examined locations in the investigation. Photographs were taken, evidence preserved, biological samples collected, and potential weapons identified. Investigators understood that the physical evidence inside the apartment would ultimately determine whether the sequence of events described by the suspects could withstand scientific scrutiny. In the days that followed, forensic specialists would begin connecting those physical traces into a coherent reconstruction of the crime. DNA, fingerprints, biological evidence, and the condition of the victim's injuries would gradually establish a timeline far more reliable than memory alone. The investigation was only beginning, but one fact had already become unmistakably clear. Luca Varani's death was not the result of an accident, nor of a spontaneous confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. The evidence revealed a prolonged and exceptionally violent homicide whose brutality demanded careful examination. Yet while investigators could now begin answering the question of what happened inside the apartment, an equally difficult question remained unresolved. Why had it happened at all? That question, perhaps the most troubling of the entire case, would dominate the investigation, shape the courtroom proceedings, and leave Italy confronting the unsettling possibility that one of its most shocking murders might ultimately have no conventional motive at all. The discovery of Luca Varani's body transformed what had been hidden inside a private apartment into one of Italy's most closely scrutinized homicide investigations. Until Manuel Fafo confessed to members of his family, the events that had unfolded in the Colatino apartment remained known only to the two men who had been present during the attack. His admission marked the moment when secrecy gave way to accountability. After hearing what Fafo had revealed, his family contacted the authorities, setting into motion the official investigation that would ultimately reconstruct every known stage of the crime. Police officers arrived at the apartment and made the grim discovery of Luca Varani's body. What they encountered immediately confirmed that they were dealing with a homicide of extraordinary violence. From that moment forward, every action taken by investigators followed a carefully structured process designed to preserve evidence and establish the facts with scientific precision. The apartment was secured as a crime scene. Access was restricted to prevent contamination, and forensic specialists began documenting the environment exactly as they found it. Every room was photographed before objects were moved. Every visible trace of blood, every item that might carry biological evidence, and every potential weapon was carefully recorded. Crime scene investigators understand that physical evidence cannot be recreated once disturbed. Unlike witness testimony, which may change over time or be influenced by memory, forensic evidence preserves silent but objective information about what occurred. in a case where the motive itself appeared unusually difficult to explain. The physical evidence would become even more important because it offered investigators an impartial record of the events that had taken place inside the apartment. One of the first priorities was identifying and preserving the objects believed to have been used during the assault. According to the subsequent forensic examination, investigators recovered the weapons that prosecutors believed had been used to attack Luca Varani. These items were subjected to extensive laboratory analysis. Specialists searched for fingerprints, biological material, and DNA that could establish who had handled the weapons and how they were connected to the crime. Such examinations require extraordinary care. Samples are collected using sterile procedures, sealed, cataloged, and transferred through documented chains of custody to ensure that every piece of evidence remains legally reliable when presented before a court. As laboratory testing progressed, investigators began receiving results that significantly strengthened the prosecution's case. The forensic analysis identified both DNA and fingerprints belonging to Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado on the weapons associated with the attack. These findings proved critically important because they directly connected both defendants to the instruments used during the homicide. Physical evidence of this nature carries exceptional weight in criminal proceedings because it is independent of personal interpretation. Unlike statements that may later be challenged or altered, biological evidence remains rooted in measurable scientific analysis. In this case, prosecutors argued that the forensic results contradicted any suggestion that only one individual had physically participated in the assault. Instead, the presence of evidence linking both men to the weapons supported the conclusion that each had played an active role in the killing. The forensic examination extended far beyond the weapons themselves. Medical experts conducted a detailed autopsy to determine the precise cause and manner of death. Their findings confirmed that Luca had suffered multiple traumatic injuries consistent with repeated blunt force and sharp force attacks. The examination also established that numerous wounds had been inflicted while he was still alive. This conclusion became essential for investigators because it helped reconstruct the sequence of violence and demonstrated that the assault continued over a prolonged period rather than occurring as a single brief outburst. The cause of death was determined to be blood loss combined with multiple traumatic injuries. These medical findings aligned with the physical evidence recovered inside the apartment, allowing investigators to construct a timeline supported by both forensic science and the condition of the crime scene itself. While forensic specialists examined the physical evidence, detectives simultaneously reconstructed the chronology of events leading up to and following the homicide. They reviewed communications, statements, and the sequence of known actions established through the investigation. According to the evidence, Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado had spent the previous days inside the apartment consuming large quantities of cocaine, alcohol, and other substances while sleeping very little. Prosecutors considered this background important because it explained the environment in which the later decisions occurred. However, investigators also recognized that substance use alone could not explain every aspect of the crime. Their task was not simply to establish that drugs had been consumed, but to determine whether the evidence demonstrated deliberate criminal conduct before, during, and after the homicide. The reconstruction therefore examined each stage separately. Investigators established that Marco Prado contacted Luca Varani and invited him to the apartment after offering approximately 100 euros for a sexual encounter. Luca accepted the invitation and arrived without any known indication that he expected violence. Evidence later showed that after entering the apartment, he was given alcohol and medication intended to reduce his ability to resist. The prolonged assault followed, ending in his death. Yet the investigation did not stop there. Detectives also carefully documented what occurred after the homicide because post-crime behavior often provides insight into an individual's awareness of wrongdoing. According to the established timeline, the defendants partially cleaned the apartment after Luca died. They hid some of his clothing and later sent messages from his phone in an apparent effort to create the impression that he was still alive. Investigators viewed these actions as significant because they reflected attempts to delay discovery of the crime. Although the concealment was ultimately unsuccessful, each action formed another piece of the evidentiary chain presented during prosecution. Detectives then examined the defendants' movements after leaving the apartment. Evidence showed that they went to various bars and continued drinking following the homicide. Investigators incorporated these movements into the overall timeline, demonstrating that the defendants left the crime scene before authorities were notified. Eventually, however, the sequence ended with Manuel Fafo confessing to his family, leading directly to police intervention. Throughout the investigation, detectives continually compared witness statements with forensic findings to determine whether each account accurately reflected the available evidence. One of the central questions concerned the degree of participation by each defendant. Because violent crimes involving multiple perpetrators sometimes involve conflicting attempts to shift responsibility, independent forensic confirmation became especially important. The DNA and fingerprint evidence proved decisive in this respect. According to prosecutors, the scientific findings undermined arguments suggesting that only one person had directly carried out the fatal assault. Instead, the evidence supported the conclusion that both defendants had physically participated. As investigators assembled these facts into a coherent narrative, another question continued to dominate public attention. Why had Luca Varani been chosen? Traditional homicide investigations frequently uncover motives involving financial disputes, jealousy, revenge, organized criminal activity, or long-standing personal conflicts. Yet detectives found no evidence supporting any of these familiar explanations. Prosecutors ultimately concluded that there had been no personal hatred directed specifically toward Luca. He had not been targeted because of an existing dispute. He had not been selected for financial gain. Instead, according to the prosecution's reconstruction, the intention to kill emerged after prolonged cocaine and alcohol consumption during the days leading up to the crime. Investigators examined Manuel Fafo's statements describing conversations about harming someone, without identifying a particular victim. They also considered his account that the two men had driven through Rome searching for a random target before Marco Prado eventually contacted Luca, someone he already knew. While such statements formed part of the investigative record, prosecutors relied heavily on the objective forensic evidence to support the factual reconstruction presented in court. The apparent absence of a conventional motive became one of the defining features of the investigation. It also generated intense public discussion because it challenged many assumptions about violent crime. For experienced investigators, establishing motive is often helpful, but it is not legally required when sufficient evidence demonstrates who committed the offense and how it occurred. In the Luca Varani investigation, the combination of forensic science, physical evidence, the reconstructed timeline, and the defendant's own actions after the homicide created a comprehensive evidentiary foundation. Nevertheless, detectives remained aware that understanding why the crime occurred would likely remain more complicated than determining how it had been carried out. By the time investigators completed their reconstruction, the sequence of events had become remarkably clear. Days of heavy cocaine and alcohol use inside the apartment were followed by discussions about harming someone. Marco Prado contacted Luca Varani and invited him to the apartment. After Luca arrived, he was given alcohol and medication intended to reduce his resistance. A prolonged and exceptionally violent assault followed, resulting in his death from blood loss and multiple traumatic injuries. The apartment was partially cleaned. Some of the victim's clothing was hidden. Messages were sent from his phone, and the defendants left to drink at bars before Manuel Fafo eventually confessed to his family. Each stage of that sequence was supported by physical evidence, forensic analysis, or investigative findings. With the investigation substantially complete, the case moved from the hands of detectives and forensic experts into the courtroom. There, prosecutors would argue that the evidence demonstrated the responsibility of both defendants beyond reasonable doubt. The defense would raise issues concerning prolonged drug use and mental condition, while the court would ultimately be asked to answer not only who committed the crime, but whether intoxication diminished legal responsibility. The next phase of the case would determine how Italian justice responded to one of the country's most disturbing acts of seemingly motiveless violence. With the investigative phase complete, the focus of the Luca Verani case shifted from the crime scene to the courtroom. The apartment in Rome had already yielded the physical evidence. Forensic experts had documented the injuries, analyzed the weapons, and reconstructed the sequence of events. Detectives had assembled a timeline that stretched from the days of prolonged cocaine and alcohol use through the fatal assault, the attempted concealment of the crime, and finally Manuel Fafo's confession to his family. Now the responsibility for evaluating that evidence rested with the Italian judicial system. The trial would not simply revisit the horrifying facts already uncovered during the investigation. Instead, it would examine whether the available evidence proved the legal responsibility of the defendants beyond reasonable doubt, and whether the circumstances surrounding the crime altered the degree of that responsibility under Italian law. Although the brutality of the killing had already generated widespread public outrage, the court's role was fundamentally different from that of public opinion. Judges were required to evaluate objective evidence rather than emotional reaction. Every forensic report, every laboratory analysis, every documented action before and after the homicide had to be examined according to legal standards. Public anger, however understandable, could never replace proof. Likewise, speculation about the defendant's thoughts or intentions could not substitute for evidence presented during the proceedings. The courtroom therefore became the place where the investigation's findings would be tested against the requirements of criminal law. Prosecutors built their case around a combination of physical evidence, forensic science, and the reconstructed chronology established during the investigation. Central to their argument was the conclusion that both Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado had actively participated in the killing of Luca Verani, rather than relying primarily on statements made by the defendants. The prosecution emphasized the objective evidence recovered from the crime scene. The forensic analysis had identified DNA and fingerprints belonging to both men on the weapons associated with the assault. According to prosecutors, these findings directly contradicted any suggestion that only one individual had physically carried out the attack, while the other remained uninvolved. The prosecution argued that the scientific evidence demonstrated participation by both defendants, and that this conclusion was reinforced by the broader sequence of events reconstructed during the investigation. Prosecutors also presented the actions occurring after Luca's death as important evidence of criminal responsibility. Investigators had established that the apartment was partially cleaned. Some of the victims' clothing had been hidden, and messages had been sent from Luca's phone after he was already dead. These actions, prosecutors argued, reflected attempts to delay discovery of the homicide rather than efforts to seek medical assistance or report the crime. In criminal proceedings, conduct following an offense can sometimes provide insight into an individual's awareness of what has occurred. While post-crime behavior alone cannot establish guilt, prosecutors maintained that the concealment efforts formed part of a larger pattern consistent with conscious participation in the offense. The defendant's decision to leave the apartment and continue drinking at bars before authorities were contacted also became part of the overall narrative presented before the court. At the center of the legal proceedings, however, stood a question that extended beyond the factual reconstruction of the homicide itself. Both Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado had spent days consuming significant quantities of cocaine, alcohol, and other substances before the crime. This background had already been established during the investigation, and it naturally raised questions concerning the extent to which intoxication affected their mental state at the time of the killing. Such questions are not unusual in criminal law. Courts frequently encounter cases in which defendants argue that substance use impaired judgment or reduced personal responsibility. The challenge for judges is distinguishing between an altered mental state and a legal incapacity. That eliminates criminal responsibility altogether. In the Luca Verani case, the court ultimately drew a clear distinction between these concepts. The judges acknowledged the extensive substance use that formed part of the factual background, but they did not conclude that intoxication removed the defendant's ability to understand the nature of their actions. Instead, the court determined that both men remained legally responsible for what they had done. This conclusion became one of the defining legal outcomes of the case. The proceedings therefore reinforced an important principle within the justice system. Although drug and alcohol consumption may provide context for understanding how events developed, it does not automatically excuse criminal conduct or eliminate accountability. The prosecution also addressed one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire case, the apparent absence of a conventional motive. Throughout the investigation, detectives had found no evidence of financial conflict, personal revenge, long-standing hostility, or organized criminal involvement. Luca Verani had not been selected because of an ongoing dispute or because he possessed something his attackers wanted to obtain. Instead, prosecutors concluded that the intention to kill emerged during the prolonged period of cocaine and alcohol use inside the apartment. According to the evidence presented, the defendants had discussed harming someone without identifying a specific target. And after failing to find a random victim while driving through Rome, Marco Prado contacted Luca, someone he already knew. The prosecution argued that this sequence explained how Luca ultimately became the victim despite the absence of any personal conflict between him and the defendants. Although the motive remained deeply disturbing because of its apparent meaninglessness, prosecutors maintained that motive itself was not required to establish criminal responsibility when the physical evidence clearly demonstrated who committed the offense. The court's task was therefore not to explain every psychological dimension of the crime, but to determine whether the legal elements of homicide had been proven. After considering the available evidence, the court concluded that they had. The violence inflicted upon Luca Verani was recognized as exceptionally cruel. The forensic findings had established a prolonged assault involving repeated blows with a hammer and multiple stab wounds, many of which were inflicted while the victim was still alive. The duration of the attack and the nature of the injuries became significant factors in the court's assessment. Rather than viewing the killing as a brief explosion of uncontrolled violence, the judges recognized circumstances demonstrating exceptional brutality. This legal characterization would influence the severity of the sentence imposed upon Manuel Fafo. In 2017, the court found Manuel Fafo guilty and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. The sentence reflected not only his participation in the homicide, but also the aggravating circumstances identified during the proceedings. Yet the judicial process did not end with the initial verdict. As is common in many criminal justice systems, the case proceeded through the appellate process, allowing the higher court to review both the legal reasoning and the sentence imposed. In 2018, the appellate court upheld the 30-year prison sentence. It also confirmed the aggravating circumstance, recognizing the exceptional cruelty of the crime. This decision reinforced the conclusions reached during the original proceedings and marked the final judicial outcome for Manuel Fafo. His conviction remained one of the most significant legal consequences arising from the investigation. The proceedings involving Marco Prado, however, followed a very different course. While awaiting trial, Prado remained in custody. Before the judicial process concerning him could reach its conclusion, a separate tragedy occurred within the prison system. In May 2017, Marco Prado died by suicide in his cell at Velletri prison. His death ended the criminal proceedings against him before the court could deliver a final judgment. In his individual case, under Italian law, criminal proceedings cannot continue against a deceased defendant. And the case against Prado, therefore, came to a legal end without a final verdict being issued. This outcome left the judicial record incomplete in one important respect. While the evidence gathered during the investigation remained part of the historical record, the courts never reached the stage of issuing a definitive judgment regarding Prado's individual criminal liability because his death intervened before the process concluded. For the families affected by the case, this distinction carried emotional as well as legal significance. The death of a defendant before the conclusion of trial prevents the judicial system from delivering the same degree of legal finality that accompanies a completed verdict. Nevertheless, the broader reconstruction of the crime, supported by forensic evidence and investigative findings, remained unchanged. By the conclusion of the legal proceedings, several facts had been firmly established. Luca Varani had died as the result of a prolonged and exceptionally violent assault inside Manuel Fafo's apartment in Rome. The investigation had connected both defendants to the weapons through DNA and fingerprint evidence. The timeline reconstructed by investigators had been accepted as the factual framework of the case. The courts had determined that prolonged cocaine and alcohol use did not eliminate criminal responsibility. And Manuel Fafo's 30-year sentence, later affirmed on appeal, reflected that conclusion. Yet despite these legal outcomes, one aspect of the case continued to resist complete resolution. Courts can determine guilt, impose punishment, and establish legal responsibility. They can identify aggravating circumstances and evaluate forensic evidence with extraordinary precision. What they cannot always provide is a satisfying explanation for why certain crimes occur. In the Luca Varani case, the judicial process answered many factual questions while leaving a deeper philosophical one unresolved. How could an ordinary young man lose his life in an act of such extraordinary violence without the traditional motives that usually accompany homicide? That lingering question would continue to shape public discussion long after the courtroom proceedings had ended, ensuring that the case remained not only a legal landmark, but also one of the most troubling examples of seemingly motiveless violence in modern Italian criminal history. When the courtroom proceedings gradually came to an end, the legal system had fulfilled its primary responsibility. Investigators had reconstructed the events surrounding Luca Varani's death. Forensic specialists had documented the physical evidence with scientific precision. The courts had evaluated that evidence according to the standards of criminal law, concluding that Manuel Fafo bore legal responsibility for the homicide and confirming his 30-year prison sentence on appeal. While the proceedings against Marco Prado ended following his death by suicide in prison before a final judgment could be reached. From a legal perspective, the case had reached its conclusion. Yet outside the courtroom, the conversations were only beginning. Across Italy, the murder of Luca Varani quickly became more than a criminal case discussed in newspapers or evening television broadcasts. It became a subject of national reflection because it challenged deeply held assumptions about why people commit acts of extreme violence. Most societies develop an informal understanding of violent crime. Even when murder shocks the public, there is often an explanation that, while tragic, appears understandable in a human sense. Revenge may grow from years of conflict. Jealousy can escalate into rage. Financial disputes can become desperate confrontations. Organized criminal activity follows its own brutal logic. None of these motives excuse violence, but they provide a framework that allows investigators and the public to understand why events unfolded as they did. The death of Luca Varani seemed to resist those familiar explanations. According to the conclusions presented during the investigation, there was no long-standing hatred between the victim and the perpetrators. There was no financial dispute waiting to erupt into violence. There was no evidence that Luca had become involved in an escalating personal conflict. Instead, prosecutors concluded that the intention to kill emerged during a period marked by prolonged cocaine use, heavy alcohol consumption, and severe sleep deprivation. For many observers, this explanation proved deeply unsettling because it suggested that the victim had not been targeted for who he was, but rather because he happened to become the person who answered an invitation at the wrong moment. That possibility transformed the case into something larger than an isolated criminal act. It became a reminder of how fragile ordinary life can sometimes be when it unexpectedly intersects with circumstances no reasonable person could anticipate. Throughout the public discussion that followed, one issue repeatedly surfaced: the role of drugs and alcohol in violent crime. The investigation established that Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado had spent days consuming cocaine, alcohol, and other substances while sleeping very little. Their prolonged intoxication formed an undeniable part of the factual background. At the same time, the courts reached an equally important conclusion by determining that substance use did not eliminate criminal responsibility. This distinction became central to the broader debate. Some observers focused on the destructive psychological effects associated with extended cocaine use combined with alcohol and sleep deprivation, arguing that the case illustrated how profoundly such conditions can distort judgment. Others emphasized the court's decision that despite these circumstances, both men retained sufficient awareness to be held accountable under criminal law. The legal outcome therefore reinforced an important principle. Explanation is not the same as excuse. Understanding the context surrounding a crime does not diminish responsibility for committing it. Another subject raised by the case involved mental health and the limits of understanding human behavior. Criminal investigations are designed to answer practical questions. Who committed the offense? How did it happen? What evidence supports those conclusions? Yet some crimes leave behind questions that extend beyond the reach of forensic science or legal reasoning. The Luca Varani case became one of those examples. Even after investigators reconstructed the timeline and prosecutors presented their conclusions, many people continued asking why two individuals would engage in such extraordinary violence against someone with whom they had no significant personal conflict. The available evidence provided part of the answer, but not all of it. The investigation explained the sequence of events without fully resolving the deeper psychological mystery for criminologists and mental health professionals. The case became an example of how certain acts of violence cannot always be reduced to a single motive or simple explanation. Human behavior, particularly under extreme conditions involving prolonged substance abuse, may become dangerously unpredictable while still remaining subject to legal accountability. Beyond these broader discussions, however, it is important to remember that every criminal case has a human center. Public attention often gravitates toward perpetrators because their actions dominate headlines, court proceedings, and media coverage. Yet true crime should never lose sight of the person whose life was taken. Before March 2016, Luca Varani was not a symbol or a headline. He was a 23-year-old man living in Rome, working freelance jobs, maintaining a long-term relationship, and described by those who knew him as friendly and sociable. Those simple facts matter because they remind us that victims exist outside the circumstances of their deaths. They have relationships, routines, ambitions, and futures that are abruptly interrupted by violence. In Luca's case, the available evidence offers no indication that he anticipated becoming the victim of a homicide when he accepted Marco Prado's invitation. He entered the apartment without knowledge of the conversations, prolonged drug use, or deteriorating judgment that investigators would later reconstruct. That absence of awareness makes the tragedy even more profound. His final decision was made without access to the information that history would eventually reveal. The attempted concealment of the crime after his death further illustrates how the consequences of violence extend beyond the immediate act itself. Messages were sent from Luca's phone after he had already died. Some of his clothing was hidden. The apartment was partially cleaned. These actions delayed the discovery of the truth, even if only briefly. Eventually, Manuel Fafo confessed to his family, leading authorities to the apartment and allowing investigators to begin the process that would uncover the facts. Without that confession, the investigation might have followed a very different path. Instead, the physical evidence preserved inside the apartment enabled forensic experts to reconstruct what had occurred with remarkable clarity. DNA, fingerprints, medical findings, and crime scene analysis combined to establish a factual record that ultimately withstood judicial scrutiny. The case also demonstrated the indispensable role of forensic science in modern criminal investigations. Public attention often focuses on dramatic courtroom moments or emotional testimony. But the foundation of many successful prosecutions rests upon careful scientific work conducted far from television cameras. In the Luca Verani investigation, objective evidence became the strongest witness. Biological traces connected individuals to the weapons. Medical examinations established the cause of death and the sequence of injuries. Crime scene documentation preserved details that could later be evaluated in court without relying solely on memory or conflicting accounts. These scientific methods transformed a horrifying crime into a legally provable case, ensuring that judicial decisions rested on evidence rather than speculation. Yet even after the legal process reached its conclusion, one uncomfortable truth remained. Justice can impose punishment, but it cannot restore what has been lost. A prison sentence, regardless of its length, cannot return a young man's future to him or erase the suffering experienced by those who knew him. Courts exist to establish accountability, not to reverse tragedy. That reality forms one of the most sobering aspects of every homicide investigation. Behind every case number, every forensic report, and every judicial opinion stands a life that cannot be replaced. The legacy of the Luca Verani case, therefore, extends beyond its legal significance. It remains a cautionary example of the devastating consequences that can arise when prolonged substance abuse, deteriorating judgment, and deliberate acts of violence converge. It also serves as a reminder that crimes lacking a conventional motive may leave society with questions that no verdict can completely answer. The courts resolved the legal issues before them. Investigators documented the facts. Historians and criminologists continue to study the case. But for many people, the memory that endures is not the names of the perpetrators or the details of the trial. It is the image of an ordinary 23-year-old whose life ended in circumstances he could never have foreseen. In remembering Luca Verani, the focus should remain not on the individuals who committed the crime, but on the value of the life that was taken. His story illustrates why every homicide investigation matters, why every piece of forensic evidence deserves careful examination, and why the pursuit of justice continues even when no explanation can fully account for human cruelty. Some cases are remembered because they solved complex mysteries. Others become famous because they changed laws or investigative techniques. The murder of Luca Verani is remembered for a different reason. It forced an entire nation to confront the unsettling reality that not every act of violence fits into familiar patterns, and that sometimes the greatest challenge is not discovering who committed the crime, but accepting that the answer to why may never feel sufficient. In the end, perhaps the most meaningful lesson is also the simplest. Behind every true crime story is a real human being whose future was stolen, whose loved ones were left with irreversible loss, and whose memory deserves far more attention than the individuals responsible for that loss. That is why, long after the headlines have faded and the courtrooms have emptied, the name that should remain at the heart of this story is not that of the perpetrators, but of Luca Verani. Continue beyond the formal conclusion can still be addressed by treating this section as an extended reflection built strictly from the facts already established, without introducing any new events or speculative developments. What remains after the trial, after the verdict, and after the formal closure of criminal proceedings is not additional action within the case itself, but the longer and more complex process of societal absorption, interpretation, and memory. In the years following the legal conclusion of the Luca Verani case, the facts themselves did not change, but the meaning people derived from those facts continued to evolve. The judicial system had already completed its function. The investigation had established the sequence of events. Forensic science had confirmed the involvement of both Manuel Fafo and Marco Prado through DNA and fingerprint evidence on the weapons. And the courts had determined legal responsibility while affirming the aggravating circumstance of exceptional cruelty in the case of Fafo. Yet once the structure of investigation and judgment was complete, the case entered a different phase, one that exists in many high-profile crimes. The phase of collective interpretation. In this phase, the central question is no longer what happened, because that has already been legally established, but how such an event should be understood within a broader social and psychological context. One of the most persistent aspects of the Verani case that continued to be discussed was the absence of a conventional motive. Throughout the investigation and trial, no evidence was found of personal hatred, financial conflict, or long-standing animosity between the victim and the perpetrators. Instead, prosecutors presented a reconstruction in which prolonged cocaine use, heavy alcohol consumption, and extreme sleep deprivation created a destabilized environment in which violent intent emerged without a traditional interpersonal cause. This aspect of the case made it particularly difficult for the public to categorize, because most commonly understood narratives of violent crime rely on recognizable motives. When those motives are absent or unclear, the human mind struggles to find familiar patterns to explain the outcome. This difficulty contributed to the lasting impact of the case in Italy, where it became a reference point in discussions about the limits of rational explanation in criminal behavior. Another element that continued to define public reflection was the role of substance abuse. The court had already made a clear legal distinction. While cocaine and alcohol consumption formed part of the factual background, they did not eliminate criminal responsibility. Both defendants were found capable of understanding and intending their actions under Italian law. This distinction became an important point of reference in broader debates about accountability, particularly in cases involving severe intoxication. The Verani case illustrated how legal systems must balance two realities simultaneously, acknowledging the influence of altered mental states while maintaining the principle that responsibility cannot be fully excused by voluntary consumption of substances. In the absence of a clear motive, attention also turned to the psychological interpretation of the events as established by investigators and prosecutors. The documented conversations between Fafo and Prado about harming someone, the reported attempt to find a random victim while driving through Rome, and the eventual decision to contact Luca Varani were all elements that formed part of the reconstructed timeline. However, even when assembled into a coherent sequence, these facts did not produce a psychologically satisfying explanation in the traditional sense. Instead, they described a progression of decisions under conditions of extreme intoxication and impaired judgment. This distinction between description and explanation became central to how the case was later analyzed in criminological discussions. It demonstrated that in some instances, criminal investigations can establish how events unfolded with precision, while still leaving the deeper question of why individuals reach certain decisions only partially answered. The victim, Luca Varani, remained at the center of the case in its legal conclusion, but over time, public memory often risks shifting focus toward perpetrators in high-profile trials. The facts of the case, however, consistently redirect attention back to him. He was 23 years old, living in Rome, working freelance, described as sociable, and in a long-term relationship. He had no known involvement in conflicts that could explain the violence he suffered. His presence in the apartment was the result of an agreement to meet someone he knew, under circumstances that, based on available evidence, gave him no indication of imminent danger. These facts are not interpretive. They are part of the established record of the investigation. They serve as a reminder that before becoming the subject of a criminal case, he was an ordinary person whose life was not defined by the events that ended it. The legal outcomes of the case also shaped its lasting significance. Manuel Fafo's conviction to 30 years in prison, later upheld on appeal with aggravating circumstances for exceptional cruelty, established a clear judicial conclusion regarding his responsibility. The death of Marco Prado before the completion of his trial introduced a different kind of legal ending, one in which proceedings ceased without a final judgment due to his suicide in custody. Together, these outcomes closed the formal judicial process while leaving the evidentiary record intact. That record continues to define how the case is understood in legal and academic contexts. Beyond the courtroom, the Varani case also became part of a broader discussion in Italy about the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and violent behavior. While the court's decision affirmed criminal responsibility, the circumstances of prolonged drug use and sleep deprivation raise questions among professionals studying behavioral extremes. These discussions did not challenge the verdict, but rather sought to understand how such conditions can distort decision-making processes while still remaining within the boundaries of legal accountability. In this sense, the case became less about a single explanation and more about the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions. Ultimately, what remains after all legal and investigative processes are completed is a combination of established fact and enduring discomfort. The facts are clear. A young man lost his life in a prolonged and exceptionally violent assault carried out by two individuals whose actions were later confirmed through forensic evidence and judicial proceedings. The discomfort arises from the absence of a simple narrative that can fully contain or explain those facts. There is no single motive that resolves the case into something easily understandable. Instead, there is a sequence of events that the law can document and judge, but not fully translate into moral or psychological clarity. In remembering the Luca Varani case, the most important element is not the attempt to expand the story beyond what is known, but to remain anchored in what has been firmly established, the identity of the victim, the sequence of actions confirmed by investigation, the forensic evidence linking the perpetrators to the crime, and the judicial conclusions regarding responsibility. Everything beyond that belongs not to the case itself, but to the ongoing human effort to understand violence within the limits of what can and cannot be explained. Continuing from the established record of the case and the already completed judicial and analytical narrative, This final extension, referred to here as a concluding epilogue rather than a new phase of events, does not introduce any new developments, but instead deepens the final perspective on what has already been firmly established through investigation, forensic evidence, and court rulings. After the legal system has spoken, after the appeals process has confirmed the sentence of Manuel Fafo, and after the proceedings against Marco Prado have ended due to his death in custody, what remains is not action, but permanence, the permanence of facts, the permanence of consequences, and the permanence of absence. The death of Luca Varani is no longer an unfolding event in any procedural sense. It is a closed case within the justice system, but an open wound within public consciousness. As is often the case when a crime contains elements that resist simple interpretation, the confirmed facts remain unchanged. A 23-year-old man lost his life inside an apartment in Rome after a prolonged and exceptionally violent assault. Forensic analysis established the involvement of both defendants through biological evidence, and the courts determined that the actions met the threshold of criminal responsibility with aggravating circumstances reflecting exceptional cruelty. These are not interpretations, but conclusions anchored in evidence and legal judgment. Yet beyond these conclusions lies the enduring tension between legal closure and human comprehension. The justice system is designed to answer questions of responsibility, causation, and accountability. But it is not designed to exhaust the meaning of why such events occur in a psychological or existential sense. In the Varani case, that gap between legal certainty and emotional understanding became particularly pronounced because the traditional structures that people often rely on to interpret violence, clear motive, direct conflict, identifiable escalation, were either absent or insufficient to fully account for what occurred. This absence did not weaken the legal findings. Rather, it highlighted the distinction between judicial truth and narrative satisfaction. Over time, cases like this tend to occupy a specific place in collective memory, not because they are the most statistically common forms of violence, but because they disrupt expectations about how violence is supposed to function. The human mind seeks patterns, and when those patterns are disrupted, the case remains present in discussion long after its procedural conclusion. The Varani case, therefore, continues to be referenced in broader conversations about criminal behavior, not as an isolated anomaly, but as an example of how multiple factors, substance abuse, social interaction, impaired judgment, and voluntary actions, can converge in a way that produces catastrophic outcomes without fitting neatly into traditional categories of motive-driven crime. Importantly, however, none of these contextual considerations alter the foundational legal reality established by the courts. Responsibility was affirmed, evidence was conclusive, and the actions were judged within the framework of Italian criminal law. The existence of contributing circumstances does not dissolve accountability. It only situates it within a broader context that helps explain conditions without excusing outcomes. At the center of all analysis, reflection, and documentation remains the victim. The name Luca Varani represents not a concept or a symbol, but a real individual whose life was interrupted at 23 years of age. Every factual detail preserved in the investigation, the forensic reconstructions, the timeline of events, the medical conclusions, and the judicial rulings, ultimately points back to the reality of a human life that ended in circumstances he did not choose and could not have foreseen. While the perpetrator's actions were examined extensively in legal terms, the irreversible consequence of those actions defines the case in its most fundamental form. No judicial outcome can extend beyond acknowledgement and accountability. It cannot restore what was lost. As time passes, the role of such cases in public discourse often shifts from immediate shock to longer-term reflection. They become reference points for discussions about criminal justice, substance abuse, legal responsibility, and the limits of human behavior under extreme conditions. However, beneath these broader discussions, the essential facts remain fixed and unchanged. A life was taken. Responsibility was established. The legal process concluded. And the unanswered questions, those relating not to fact but to deeper human understanding, remain. Part of the case's legacy. In the end, the Luca Verani case stands as a convergence of clarity and ambiguity. Clarity in what was proven and judged, and ambiguity in the deeper human questions it leaves behind. It is precisely this combination that ensures the case is remembered not only within legal archives, but also within the broader cultural and psychological landscape of how societies confront acts of extreme violence,